In-class activity 11A, testing the waters. As we have seen, statistics can be an important tool to help us make inferences about a population when we are only able to consider a sample. Hypothesis testing can be used to explore whether there has been a change in a particular population parameter, or whether a parameter is actually different from what had previously been assumed. In 2014, residents of Flint, Michigan, began to suspect their water was contaminated with lead after the city switched its water source. Michigan's Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, conducted an investigation and found Flint's water to be compliant with federal water safety regulations, which require that under 10% of homes yield water samples that have lead levels of 15 ppb or above. ppb stands for parts per billion. However, the residents of the city were not convinced, and they took their own sample of residences as part of the Flint water study. 1, call a water sample contaminated if it contains lead levels of 15 ppb or above. What percent of residences in the Flint water study sample returning contaminated water samples would convince you that the actual proportion of all residences with contaminated water in Flint is above 10%? Is above 10%. Answers will vary. Possible answers include 15%, 20%, 25%, or anything above 10%. Objective for the activity. You will understand that low probability events can be considered as evidence, specifically against a null hypothesis and in support of an alternative hypothesis. Specifically against a null hypothesis and in support of an alternative hypothesis. You will be able to identify in context whether sample statistics would serve as evidence against a null hypothesis. And construct null and alternative hypotheses for a hypothesis test. So, 2. It was the onus of the Flint water study, FWS, to convince the EPA, the governor, and other officials that the city of Flint was actually not compliant with federal water regulations. In other words, it was their responsibility to provide convincing evidence that the current assumption that under 10% of residences in the city had contaminated water was false. Part A, what is the population parameter of interest in this study? Well, the population parameter in the city of Flint, the proportion of residences in the city of Flint with contaminated water, that is the population parameter. So of all the residences in the city. That proportion is the parameter in this study. B, the compliance threshold for water safety is 10%. Let's suppose a worst case scenario that Flint met this threshold exactly. Considering this situation as a hypothesis test, what is the null hypothesis? Remember, null hypothesis has equal sign. Null hypothesis has equal sign. So our null hypothesis H0 is P equals 0.10. The null hypothesis H0 or H null is P equals 0.10. That is 0.10 because of this 10%. Remember, P is the proportion for all residences in the city of Flint. C, part C, the residents who led the change in Flint water study was convinced there was a higher proportion of homes in the city with contaminated water than is allowable under federal guidelines. What was their alternative hypothesis? Well, since the null hypothesis is P equals 0.10, the alternative hypothesis has an inequality sign, and they're claiming it is more. So alternative hypothesis HA is P greater than 0.10, greater than for the alternative hypothesis. Okay. Number 4. In the Flint water study sample, describe what would constitute strong evidence that the city of Flint was not actually compliant with federal water safety regulations. That is, strong evidence against the null hypothesis that the city is compliant, and strong evidence that there is a higher proportion of homes with lead contaminated water than believed. Explain your answer. You can pause the video here for a moment, think about it. But the answer here would be like this. A large proportion of residences having contaminated water. That would be the evidence. This would be very unlikely if there were not actually a problem and the city was actually compliant. So if we get a large proportion of residences having contaminated water, that would be strong evidence. Okay. Let's go to number 5. Let's go to number 5. Number 5 says, the Flint water study took a sample of 271 residences in Flint, spread throughout the city, and they found water samples from the residences to be contaminated in 20% of their sample. What is the sample proportion? What is the sample proportion? We said the sample proportion is P hat equals 0.2 because P hat is 20%. And 20% as a decimal is 0.20 or simply 0.2. So using this 20%, we know that P hat is 0.2. Okay. Let's go to part B. The DE could claim that the city was compliant with federal guidelines and only 10% of residents actually had contaminated water. According to DEQ and our corresponding null hypothesis, what is the assumed population proportion of residences with contaminated water? This is an easy one. We already know it's 10%. So P, the population parameter, is 0.10. Okay. So now we have the sample proportion, we have the population proportion. Let's go to problem number 6. Number 6 says, it's a long one. Let's see if we can get it. How likely would it be for the FWS to obtain a sample with a proportion of contaminated residences as high as 0.2 if the city was actually compliant? We can use the sampling distribution of sample proportion and the normal distribution to determine this probability. Since the normal distribution is continuous, it does not make sense to consider the probability of obtaining a sample with exactly 20% contaminated residences, which of course would be 0. So since we're interested in the fact that the sample proportion was that high, we consider how likely we are to get a proportion that high or higher. We're considering how likely we are to get a proportion that high or higher. In other words, how likely are we to have a sample proportion fall in that high range of 20% or more if the true proportion, the true population proportion is only 10%. In this case, if the actual proportion of contaminated residences were only 10%, the probability of obtaining a sample with 20% or more of residences yielding contaminated samples would be the probability of the proportion being greater or equals to 0.2, which is 20%, is 0.000002. Very small, very, very tiny. So what can you conclude from this probability? Would it be very likely for the FWS to obtain a sample proportion of 0.20 or higher if the city is actually compliant? Is it very likely for this to happen? Answers here will be probably different. Let's look at possible answers. Answers will vary. The probability of obtaining proportion of contaminated residences that high or higher is extremely small. So it will be extraordinarily unlikely for the FWS to obtain a sample like that if the city were actually compliant with federal guidelines. So it's very unlikely, extremely unlikely. Number 7, what are the two possible explanations for the high proportion of residences with contaminated water that the FWS found? What are the possible explanations? Hint is to think about lesson 9.7 that we saw before. Well, there are many ways to explain this. One way is that sampling variability, that is, they just happened to draw an extremely unusual sample. Or the city is actually not compliant with federal guidelines. That is the null hypothesis. It's false. These are possible explanations. Problem 8. Consider the large proportion of residences with contaminated water found by the FWS. What would you conclude about the water in Flint based on this sample? Well, the city is probably not compliant with federal water safety regulation. There are probably more than 10% of homes in the city with lead contaminated water. So we can say the city is probably not compliant with federal water safety regulations. Number 9, in the context of the hypothesis test, would you reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis? Would you reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis? This is our answer. We concluded that the city is probably not complying with federal water safety regulation. So we reject the null hypothesis that there are only 10% of homes with contaminated water. We reject the null hypothesis. That is our conclusion there. All right. This takes us to number 10. Number 10. Notice that in conducting this hypothesis test, we began by assuming the null hypothesis was true. That is, it was already the assumption that Flint water was compliant with federal regulations. The FWS then collected evidence in support of the alternative that Flint water was not compliant. The possibilities are then that the FWS obtained enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis, or it did not obtain enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis. As we saw in the preview assignment, the only possible conclusions of a hypothesis test are to reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis. Let me say it again. The only possible conclusions of a hypothesis test are to reject the null hypothesis or to fail to reject the null hypothesis. There is never a conclusion to a hypothesis test in which one accepts the null hypothesis. Once more, there is never a conclusion to a hypothesis test in which one accepts the null hypothesis. In other words, describe only the possible conclusions of this hypothesis test and explain why it would not be valid to conclude from the probabilistic evidence in this test that Flint is compliant with federal regulations. Let's say it again. In your own words, describe the only possible conclusions of this hypothesis test and explain why it would not be valid to conclude from the probabilistic evidence in this test that Flint is compliant with federal regulations. So we do it in our own words. So answers will probably vary, but we'll be saying it's about the same thing. Answers will vary, but the main point should be the same. And this is it. We already assumed that the city of Flint was compliant and that the assumption was used to find the probabilistic evidence. We can't assume the city is compliant and then use the compliance to prove compliance. That would be funny. The only options available to the Flint water FWS were to show that the city was not actually compliant, or we failed to show that the city was not compliant. The FWS either obtained enough evidence that the city was not compliant, or the FWS did not obtain enough evidence to do that. Nothing else. Okay. Number 11, based on the results of the Flint water study, as well as a study done by a pediatrician on blood lead levels of children in Flint, the city switched the water supply back to the previous source, and the governor declared a state of emergency a few months later. Summarize how the Flint water study provided evidence that contributed to these decisions. So, summarize how the Flint water study provided evidence that contributed to these decisions. Again, we do this in your own words. Answers will naturally vary. Answers will vary. So, this is a possible answer. The Flint water study, FWS, took a sample of residences in Flint, and the proportion of residences that had contaminated water was much higher than the federally allowable threshold. It would be very unlikely to obtain such a sample if the city were actually compliant with federal water safety regulations. So, the conclusion that the water situation needed to be addressed is very reasonable. That is it. That's the end of lesson 11A.